My fear is that nothing changes.
I fear that the things that divide us are becoming stronger.
I fear that the November election is going to bring us 4 more years of chaos.
I fear that we'll make the wrong decision, that violence will increase, that our rights will continue to be dismantled, that people who are apathetic will remain apathetic, that I fear that people will lose hope.
I fear that small businesses won't recover. I have so many friends that have had to make the hard decision to shut their business doors. That's devastating for our country.
Well, I fear that craphead in the White House.
I think my fear is that this is not actually happening. Like someone will unzip the scene and like the truth of what's happening will come out. But if this is real.
We've got these three little girls that are in our care now. 4, 5, and a newborn. I don't know what the world's gonna look like when they're your age. When they're in high school and like, should I be saving for college? Will college even be a thing that exists? How to better prepare for if the world does recover and stay kind of similar to what we know and have all grown up with. But if things are dramatically different in unforeseen ways, how to prepare for that also.
I don't know if cities are ever going to be the same again. I don't know if there's going to be that same energy, that freedom that was there before.
My fear is that my job's never gonna come back. That's my fear. It's as simple as that.
I really fear that we stop being kind. We're no longer kind to one another. We're no longer kind to people who don't think the way we do. So that's my greatest fear.
I think my biggest fear about 2020 is that we don't learn from our mistakes. Regardless of what the situation may be, if we make mistakes, we don't learn from them and don't move past them, then we're just going to continue to repeat those things. And that's usually the snowball effect. You continue to do the same things and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it wipes out more as it goes along.
I fear his re-election and what that shows about the American people. I fear the reveal of what's underneath all the veneer of Kumbaya, we the people, all the anthems and the Constitution. But underneath that, it's just like, oh, it's racism. Okay, so you don't really mean that. You mean that only when it's convenient. So I fear that and decisions that I have to make as a result of that. Does this continue to be a place that I want to support? Does it need my help more than my contribution could be? So for me, it feels really personal, my fear. And I read a line in the New York Times this morning that said that more people are becoming first-time gun owners than in the past, like right now. And I was like, oh, that's great. What are they preparing for? So that's terrifying.
I'm fearing that we will have another wave that looks like it did in New York in April and May. I love my staff, and the whole hospital at this point is not like my staff, and I don't know what. None of us are doing well. Nobody's doing okay, and it was so difficult to go through the first time, so I'm fearing another wave.
My fear is nothing's gonna change. I'm absolutely terrified about what's going to happen next week with the election. My fear is that we will be in this pandemic for another 2 years because people can't seem to get out of their own narcissistic heads and wear a mask. Everyone does it, where they don't wear a mask or socially distance or take this virus seriously. Still, my fear is that we will continue to be in this space for many, many years to come.
From governors in virus hot zones tonight, a plea for population-wide testing as a condition to reopen the economy.
Let me just get to a place where there's actually lighting. No, does this work? Sorry, let me try this.
Hello. Oh, whoops. Better start my video. There we go. Hi.
Oh, for Christ's sake. Sorry, lighting's important.
I was muted.
Oh no, that's worse. That'll have to do. Fine, fuck it. Just so I know, how candid can I be? Are you guys in college or high school?
High school.
Damn it. All right. Nothing wrong with that. Just means I'm gonna have to curtail my, let's say my more flowery language. All right.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Is there a dog barking with you?
There is. I have a service animal.
Oh, hi, service animal. And do you have a cover on, maybe?
Oh, yes, I do. You're so smart.
Hi.
Look at me. I have been in a car all day, and I look like I have been in a car all day.
I voted today. That was lovely.
How did it feel?
Well, it was great. I took advantage of the senior line since I qualify, and it was a breeze. Actually, what I'm going to say is it was anticlimactic. I've been waiting for this day for 3 years, 360 days about, and it was anticlimactic.
How am I doing? I was about to say great, but that would be a lie. I've had a good day.
Today was a good day. This week has been better. Recently, not so good. 6 months of a pandemic is apparently my limit before I start losing, everything.
Doing good, all things considered. Doing good.
I'm calling in from Lafayette, Louisiana, land of the Huma people. Well, I just moved back to Lafayette about a year ago to help take care of my parents from New York. My family needed me here, and I was one of the only unhitched people who could kind of move easily. I'm foremost a classroom teacher, and this year I have the honor of teaching in my art form, dance.
I am a stay-at-home mom. I'm disabled, so I no longer work. I have 3 kids who all at the end of the last school year did e-learning. So being stuck in a house with 3 teenage girls is very enlightening. 2 of them butt heads, so it's very difficult to try and stay sane.
I just couldn't help but notice like the flag behind you and like your little hat, because I always gotta have a hat too.
The flag is something fairly new. My wife actually got it for me for Christmas, and it's one that actually flew over the Capitol, which is pretty cool. That's why it's special. The hat, I'm a golfer. Right here, this is. So this is a ball mark. So when my ball's on the green, I take this off and mark it. But the hat, yeah. If I can find a way to be patriotic or to show my pride, I do so when I can. And I'm bald, so I wear a hat.
I'm a trapeze coach by trade. I work on different Broadway shows, training acrobats for different scenes. Also, I run a trapeze school in Brooklyn that's closed right now. But the past couple of days, most notably, something that was actually born out of COVID was I started writing a cookbook. And I set the goal to have October 31st be the date for my first draft. And so I'm almost finished. I've been writing recipes and things like that, so.
We have a hurricane that's going to make landfall in an hour. So if all of a sudden I disappear, it's because the power went out. Hurricane Zeta, because there's been so many hurricanes in 2020 that they just had to go by the Greek alphabet. But I'm originally from Spanish Harlem, New York, and I've been living here for 4 years.
Today was a good day. This week has been better. Recently, not so good. 6 months of a pandemic is my limit before I apparently start losing, everything.
I was teaching in Russia, you see.
I was supposed to have there in February, but I found out about the baby, so March 8th or 9th.
The borders in Europe are closing.
And I called Brendan in a panic. It was 10 or 11 o'clock my time at night. Midday for Brendan said, "Do you have your passport? You need it. You need to get on a plane tomorrow."
And so I came running home, and I guess I got into JFK about 6 hours before midnight, and before the travel ban went into effect, and quarantined for a couple of weeks. And then we started plotting about how to get back to Alaska. And we ended up taking this road trip that I'm sure you know the United States is 3,000 miles. We took 10,000 miles.
Sorry, I thought that was off already. Hi, everyone. Zoom is special, isn't it? It's all of that. Oh, I was muted. This is our life.
we had Mardi Gras here in New Orleans, which is a big deal. It's literally like 6 weeks long. Like most people think of Mardi Gras as one day, but we have 2 weeks of parades alone. But we had no idea that there was this virus called coronavirus or COVID-19. The president, that man knew about it in January, but didn't tell anybody. So the mayor of New Orleans didn't know anything about this virus, and it spread. Mardi Gras was probably triple our population, and it spread like wildfire. Now, I didn't get it during Mardi Gras, but the person, whoever infected me, they got it from Mardi Gras. So we were having all this fun, and I think back, I'm like, ew, gross. Like, they throw dirty beads around you. You put them around your neck. You don't have any hand sanitizer. You eat food with your hands, and it's like, that's so gross. Now I will never live like that ever again.
COVID has been around since 2019. It didn't really land in the States till 2020, so we think, but we knew it was coming. And like right before it really hit us, we started getting word from sister hospitals. Oh, someone tested positive for COVID, like out on Long Island. Okay, they're being managed out there. They traveled to Italy or China or something. They had like a direct contact with an at-risk region in the world. And then like early March, and this, honestly, pardon my language, but this is what scared the shit out of me. There was this guy in Westchester that got it, an epidemiologist, the people that kind of go there and ask the questions about.
Where have you been?
Who have you talked to?
Who have you touched?
Who have you contacted?
They did a thorough exam, a thorough interview of this guy, and he had nothing. He had absolutely no contact with anyone that had traveled, that had been sick. And that was kind of when I was like, oh, this is here. This is real. This is going to be bad, because it's already basically here, and it's probably been here for like weeks. And when you have a virus like that, where you're not really sure what it is, and it's still flu season, people probably had it and just didn't know that they had COVID, and were still doing things like going on the subway, going to work, not wearing any masks, and just spreading it unknowingly. And in New York City, especially, I was like, this is going to blow up, and it did. So that was my big oh shit moment.
We actually started hearing about COVID before it actually made big news here in the States. My middle daughter is fluent in Mandarin, and her tutor lives in China, so she Skypes once or twice a week. So we first learned about COVID late 2018. No, that's not right. It was between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
I was literally in the middle of going to work, and then it was canceled. And then everything became canceled. Oh, and the next month's work? Canceled. Oh, and we're gonna go ahead and cancel 2 months from now, 3 months from now. So that was the last thing.
And then we got into the first couple weeks, and it was, okay, well, soccer's canceled, and we're big soccer fans, so no soccer. And then it was, okay, you know that trip you've been planning? My 14-year-old's been planning with his grandparents all summer to go out west and go all over Wyoming and Colorado, so yeah, that's not gonna happen now.
March 16th. We were actually on our way back from a 4-day winter trip, my husband and I, to Miami. And when we were hearing about what was happening when South Beach was closing, we were right on North Beach, Miami. And I looked at the hotel and I looked at the workers, and it was already quieter than it was normally this time of year, because a lot of people weren't traveling. But I just knew that things were going to shut down completely. But Miami was really in denial about it. And I was like, all these people aren't going to have jobs in a week. And then we came back to New York, and within a day, my boss said,
no one's working in the office anymore. You come in, you get a surface, you're working from home.
And we're like, whoa. And it was scary. We lost somebody that worked at my agency, died early in the pandemic, and it just was tough. So that's where I was, on a plane.
It really went from 0 to 100. One day there were no COVID patients, and then one day there were like a boatload. So I was incredibly concerned about contracting it, that's for sure. At the time, we were like the amount of PPE, the personal protective equipment we were wearing was definitely overkill. But I distinctly remember being terrified just to like take off my mask, even to have a sip of water or eat food, because there was no real like safe place. I couldn't go to the break room and then take off my mask and feel comfortable eating because colleagues are in there and they could have been exposed, etc. And so it was absolutely frightening. We also just at the time, we didn't know anything because we weren't getting any information from China. We weren't getting any information from Italy other than the wrong information. And so we didn't know really what to expect. We didn't know like what the mortality would look like. We didn't know who was going to get super sick and who was not, if it was all a crapshoot. But honestly, like one of my first COVID patients, and this was the one that really, again, just scared the living hell out of me, was this like 26-year-old kid, no other medical history, had a cough, a fever, his heart rate was through the roof, and his oxygen levels were super low, and we ended up intubating him, which means putting the breathing tube in. And it's this lady. And that was probably the scariest moment, seeing like an otherwise healthy 26-year-old on a ventilator being wheeled past me to go up to the ICU, because then it really hit home like, oh God, this could really just happen. Like anybody can end up on a vent. And for me, being on a vent is terrifying because basically to be on a vent, you have to be unconscious, right? Because you can't have a breathing tube in you and a machine breathing for you and be awake, because your natural body, your response will be to get this out of me, and you'll struggle. So anytime anyone goes on a vent, they're unconscious the whole time. So in my brain, it's you go to sleep and you might never wake up. And seeing that 26-year-old roll by, it scared the hell out of me.
We were doing Good Morning America that day. We got there, I think at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning. So this is March 12th. And my daughter Beatrix has somebody in her class. Their grandparents lived in New Rochelle. Remember way back when in New York State, only people in New Rochelle had COVID? It was then. Meanwhile, like everyone already had it. So she was out of school already and virtually at home. So I like left my wife, Martha, got her all ready to do school. So she was here on Zoom. I went, shot Good Morning America. I came back and decided to take a nap. I knew that it was possible that something was going to happen, because I think we all had that feeling of like when you know a hurricane is coming or a snowstorm, that sort of feeling times 1,000 is, I think, the anxiety we're all feeling without any of the fun of like, oh, there's going to be a snowstorm. And I came back. I decided to take a nap because I had a show, and woke up, turned on the television, and the governor was on saying the shows were closed down. It was supposed to be for 2 weeks. And here we are. It really feels like the nap that changed the world, a little like Alice in Wonderland. Like I woke up and the whole world was in this like dystopian universe. It's crazy too, because as I talk to you, I can see the flashing lights of Times Square out my window. And it really, it kind of haunts me because that's my work and there's no one there.
My mother died of COVID in March.
On March 14th, I was feeling weird. I was feeling not myself.
So mom was getting sick on and off. She was in a nursing home, so I spoke to her every day, literally every single day. She would lose her phone a lot, so I would have to call the nurse's station. They would go get her, even if it was just to say hi, but she was getting sick and we didn't know what was going on. So she in February was going in and out of the ER just because we didn't know what was happening with her. And little did we know it was most likely COVID. That's how I caught COVID as well, because I had it as well.
I felt a little run down. I felt like I was coming down with the flu. And that's when they announced that they were going to shut down, like literally that same day. And I was like, wow, this is happening. And then I started having these fevers, and the fevers didn't stop for 13 days. And I'm talking about 103.5, extremely high fevers.
So quarantine started on March 13th. On March 11th, the governor shut down all visitations to nursing homes. So on the 10th was the last time that I saw her in person. But every day after that, we'd speak to each other on FaceTime. Our last conversation was still just, how are you feeling and how are you doing? Next morning, she woke up around 7, and the head nurse was a friend of hers, so she would go by the nurse's station and wait until it was time to get everybody ready to go into breakfast. And she was mid-sentence, and she just sort of slumped over, is what the nurses told me. And she was basically gone. So there wasn't a dramatic trying to save her life kind of a thing. She just went like that. quickly, which is a blessing itself.
I went to my local urgent care clinic and they said,
What are your symptoms?
and I said, well, I feel feverish and I feel run down. Then they said,
Are you having trouble breathing?
I said, no. And they said,
Okay, well, are you pregnant?
and I said, no. And they said,
Well, you can't get tested.
and I was like, I don't know what you want me to do. I have a child at home.
That was such a strange time because no one knew what COVID really was. On March 13th, we were like, all right, we're going to stay home. We'll stay home for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then we'll go back to normal life. Well, that didn't happen. Then on the following Saturday, my mom passed away on March 21st. And then on March 22nd, while dealing with the passing of my mother, I had my first fever from COVID. And that's how the connection really hit.
And I had already started to quarantine myself away. Like the moment I felt something was happening, I separated myself from my family. And that was a 24-day quarantine that I had away where I didn't hold my child and I didn't touch my husband. And I spoke to my husband and my child on FaceTime.
I have a partner who I'm with for 17 years now, and he was sick too, but he's a unicorn because he was sick for 4 days and he was fine after that. And I was sick for a good solid 6 weeks. So it affects people differently. But having somebody here, really, I can't imagine being sick and being alone, dealing with that kind of loss.
And then I went to the hospital after the urgent care said that they weren't going to test me. I went to the hospital and I was literally like this, like shivering in the emergency room because the COVID chills coming down from a fever is intense. And they kept trying to convince me to go home. They said,
You're going to wait here hours and hours and hours to get tested. Are you sure you want to stay here?
and I said, yes, I do. I have a child at home. So I waited 5 hours in the ER to get tested. And I was having, like I said, crazy high fevers the whole time. And they said it would take me 5 days to get my results back. So I just went back home.
By that point, the funeral parlor had already had a refrigerator truck in its parking lot, and the hospitals had already had makeshift morgues on the sidewalk. It was around that time I was trying to have my mother cremated. And it took a good solid 2 weeks because they can only cremate 12 bodies a day in this particular area, in this particular time. Crematoriums can only house a certain number of people over the course of a day, so they were backed up. So I didn't get my mother's ashes until almost a month later. Plus, I was sick, so I didn't want to go into the funeral parlor. We didn't know how contagious I actually was. Would I get somebody sick? So I stayed put. It wasn't until about 6 to 8 weeks later that the funeral parlor actually walked my mother's ashes to my door because the funeral parlor was literally around the corner from where I live.
Every day I was progressively getting worse. I had fevers all the time, 24 hours a day. I had these fevers, which make your head hurt. And I literally stripped myself naked because I was just sweating through everything. And it was just so bad. And I also stopped eating. I stopped eating on March 14th. So that was about a 13-day period where I went that I didn't eat anything because I was just so sick. And so finally I got the positive test. And that day I had a 104.7 fever. And that was the highest it had ever been. And I was like, oh, I have to go back to the doctor. And they said,
all you can do is take Tylenol.
They didn't give me any medicine, nothing. They just said,
all you can do is take Tylenol. There's nothing else that you can do or that we can give you. You just have to write it out.
So I went back home. 2 days later, I started to notice that my breathing was getting worse, and I started to develop a cough, and the kind of cough that makes you feel like you're bruising from the ribs inside out. And I called the ER because it was the middle of the night, and I said, you told me that if my breathing got worse to give you a call. And the nurse said,
Stop coming here and exposing us. Stay home.
So I stayed home.
When I got sick, I was turned away from the ER and I was turned away from urgent care because I wasn't sick enough. And I know that probably saved my life because my doctor would tell me,
don't go to the store, don't go to the ER, don't go to urgent care.
But I would. I got to the point where I was so sick, I have to. And they would be like,
don't come back unless you're critical and can't breathe.
Because they had people because I would have been sitting on the hallway in a gurney, and it would have been worse because they had people who were literally dying in those hallways.
The next day, my breathing got even worse. My husband called an ambulance. They came in my room, upstairs bedroom, looked at me and said,
well, you can finish a sentence, so we're not taking you. You're young, you've no pre-existing conditions, so you're just gonna have to write it out.
A friend of mine is an ER nurse, and he said he was talking to a patient, and she said,
hold my watch, and when my daughter gets here, make sure you give it to her so she holds on to it.
And he said he knew he wasn't going to meet her daughter. And he said he turned around and she was gone. So it was that fast. But it was also that kind of trigger that really let me know that I was not as sick as I thought, even though I was pretty sick.
And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. I went a total of 4 times to the hospital where they turned me away, and I just kept getting worse. And then finally I had a particularly bad coughing spell and I started to wheeze really bad, and my breathing was really, really bad. As you can tell, I talk fast, I talk a lot. I couldn't get half a sentence out. And so finally my husband called another ambulance, and they looked at me and they said, we just have to take her.
What has life been like for you during quarantine?
Somewhere in between surreal and just slow motion and just kind of undone, if that makes sense at all.
My normal routine lately is just getting up and sending out as many job applications as I can, get some housework done, and yeah, feeling good. It's the new moon, so thinking about new things I want to bring into my life.
I am medically disabled and I have been diagnosed as agoraphobic. I was in a car accident a few years back and have had a very difficult time with my recovery. And for me, quarantine set me at ease. I did not have to worry about going out. I no longer had to worry about having to take my kids places. There were opportunities for me to really calm down, and a level of fear was actually taken off my shoulders. I'm an avid reader. I'm a knitter. I like to do things around my house. Being stuck at home, for me, golden. It was when they started telling us to go back out. That was when my fear escalated.
My grandmother died of COVID in April, and so that was kind of a stop point. We had a service in July in Colorado, so we had to figure out how to get there. We quarantined 2 weeks before we left. We quarantined 2 weeks after we got back. And that was, I think, the hardest part for us as a family, because it was July. It was sunny. It was nice outside. It was like, what can we do? We want to go to our friends. We've been invited to go to the park. We've been invited to go play soccer. We can't do that right now.
My work kind of dissolved or disappeared because it was event-based. I'd work most days. I went from that to being at home all the time. So I think it created a sense of timelessness in a way, or kind of being suspended in time without sort of set landmarks within time, without those to anchor me. What I have become accustomed to is being my life. Then I sort of just became this feeling of floating in a way. It was good because it gave me time to invest in a career transition I've been wanting to make for a while. Yeah.
Well, we're not actually in quarantine. I'm considered an essential worker. I work in a warehouse for a coal mining company, and the coal mine was considered essential. My wife teaches at a local high school, though, and has to report there every day.
Louisiana had the states with one of the highest counts of cases and death. And that was primarily because people were not regarding, all I'm thinking of are best practices. They're country folks and kind of do what they want to do anyway, because their grandmother lives across the street or down the whatever. And they have kind of narrow and stubborn views about the world.
Does that disappoint you or frustrate you in any way?
Absolutely. just because historically, what's the best way to say this? Historically, people in this region have done things to their own benefit, as opposed to the benefit of all the people who are there. So to know that disproportionately African Americans and people of color are dying doesn't, or didn't, matter to people here because of the levels of separation and segregation and just the history of race in Louisiana.
I think in other parts of the country where they didn't see that sort of dramatic surge of cases early on, that's where you have people who were initially uncertain whether that was truly necessary, and maybe not as supportive of those control measures when they were initially instituted, that unfortunately, when you look around the country, now we're seeing the results of that play out.
More like-minded people would be nice to have around.
We're bright blue dots in a pretty red rural town. And on top of that, my husband's background is in the hard sciences and neurosciences. So we've always been, wear your mask, wash your hands, stay distant, and limit gatherings. And we don't see that necessarily even on our street. We have neighbors across the street who are...
No, we don't believe in vaccines.
God will take care of us.
We're going to have people over.
We're not going to stay distant.
You get sick, we get sick.
And they're great neighbors, actually. They're the people who watch your house when you're out of town, so that's been a kind of hard dynamic to manage. And so the notion that part of this is from a political standpoint, that
Oh, this is all crap because the president says it's all crap.
it's hard to deal with when I live with somebody who's like, yeah, not so much. So it's been interesting just navigating that and navigating different friend groups. My son plays soccer, and we're fortunate that nobody goes to soccer here. It's not the sport to watch, so we've been able to go and meet the attendance guidelines set by the state and see all of his games. But when you walk into the stadium, you see people that you knew prior to COVID-19, and you thought, oh, these are great people, and no masks, not distant. You're trying to respect that, and they're not, and they don't really want to understand why. So that's been a little difficult to navigate.
I'm not a huge fan of them. I read conflicting stories. Recently, I read a story where it suggested that people who wear masks are actually more susceptible to getting the virus. I think it was based on the people they asked, though. Have you been wearing masks? Their answer was yes. But myself, if I want to go somewhere where they have that as a mandate or want to use that as a policy and they have something that maybe I want to partake in or use their business, I'll follow the guidelines and wear a mask.
A lot of the time I spent supporting staff was just acknowledging some of the simplest things that we're doing without, and that we don't even notice how much of an impact they have on us, like smiling at somebody. So when everybody's in their masks and we don't get to see each other's faces, and it's not just smiling, we mirror each other's facial expressions all the time, but it makes us feel much more seen and appreciated and understood when we can see somebody mirroring our own expression back at us. So just getting to see the spontaneous smiles of my coworkers is something I miss a lot. Also just touch.
We went to school and it was like, oh my God, I'm seeing all my friends again. Let me give you a hug. And like every time a teacher came to me and was like, oh man, Amna, you can't do it. You can't do that. Break it up, break it up. And I kind of didn't realize that those were the things I used to do so easily.
Yeah, when you're going through something difficult, being able to hug somebody, it changes our brain chemistry. Normally, if somebody I'm working with is crying, I would ask and I would put my hand on their back just to be able to have some physical contact with them, some reassurance, and also just like this little boost of oxytocin. So some of the simplest things, like being able to see each other's facial expressions and not just the eyes, and being able to touch each other, those are definitely some of the simplest things, but it's so much, right?
I'm quarantining with my mother, so I have to be very careful because she's in a high-risk group because of her age. She's 72 and she celebrated her birthday a couple of days ago. I'm in my childhood home, which I never thought I would spend this much time here ever again since I left when I was 18. But here I am now, month after month.
So have you been continuing your craft at all?
I don't. I don't. It makes me very sad to be in I don't always talk about this, especially in this kind of setting, because I get sad. And so if I get sad, having the experience of watching the news and seeing the scientists say that exactly what I do for a living is exactly what is causing this virus. Like literally when they say it's spread by aerosols that are spread by loud speaking and singing, particularly terrible in large groups of people, they couldn't describe what I do for a living more. And I do feel like in terms of spreading this disease, with the exception of like a buffet on a cruise ship, I work in the epicenter of how this spreads. Broadway was very hard hit. A lot of people got sick. And I, of course, am one of the people that goes to work and I can't wear a mask. So until everything is better, I can't go back to work. So knowing that, it makes me sad.
Do you have any anticipation for the future on what you think will happen or what you hope will happen?
I hope that somebody somehow is able to depoliticize the wearing of masks. I would like for everybody to put on a mask and get the vaccine when it comes out safely. And I think what everybody else wants, which is just to try to get back to as best as what we were doing before. I don't think that's necessarily realistic. I think we're all going to have a new normal, but that's my hope.
We joined this thing called Harvest Hosts, and basically you download this app and all these different farms and vineyards and whatever come forward, and they've got reviews and photos, and you can literally call the day of and be like, hey, we're coming through your area, Louisville, Kentucky, and your alpaca farm looks awesome. Can we
Park in your field?
And they say yes, and there's kind of like this tacit understanding that you're like, buy an alpaca sweater or a couple of scarves. And so you're meeting people constantly having different experiences, having conversations you couldn't in a million years predict, and getting yourself into situations you couldn't in 10 million years predict.
It's a little Burning Man-esque, like a temporary community for the days that you're there, and then dispersing, and then just depending on what state you're in, kind of noticing if something was happening or not. Our impression of Utah was that at that point they hadn't really noticed or cared that anything was happening yet. So the masks were totally optional. People were getting outside and hiking, staying far apart from each other, but not having that same intensity or drama that we had seen in other places. The West felt, until we got to the West Coast, the West felt like people were like, yeah, of course, we've been prepping for the apocalypse forever, duh. And we all ranch and we're already far apart. So yeah, here we go.
Yeah, generally I like to say the eagerness, both the eagerness to shake hands and the strength of the handshake increased as you went toward the center of the country and decreased as we went toward the opposite coast. And then we got to Seattle, and there they wouldn't even look at you. I mean, you being like outsiders, we were just like emblematic of the plague itself.
Seattle was really unpleasant.
Ugh, Seattle was terrible. Yeah, I will always hate that city with everything inside me. But anyways, next question.
Math is a big thing. I hate math. I hated math. My kids hate math. But now my kids walk around with these smartphones. They have everything at the tips of their fingers. They have photo math. So if they've got a problem with math, they take the picture of their math problem, and photo math helps them work through the equation. For me, it's very frustrating e-schooling. I felt that the last 4 months of the last school year were a complete waste of time. The schools were not prepared with the facilities, with the curriculum to e-school, and I truly felt that not a single one of my children learned anything between March and June of last year. Not a thing. So as a parent, that's very frustrating. I think that my middle daughter learned more from her Chinese tutor via Skype than any of my kids learned via online learning from their schools. My oldest is a junior this year, and she told me, she's like, oh yeah, I did photo math for all my math problems.
So the particular challenges are finding content online that parallel the content that gets developed in the classroom, that parallels or speaks the same language or in the same way. And then the next thing is students actually doing the assignment. So that's a big challenge. I have 2 virtual classes, and I decided that I was going to call all the parents one by one. And I called 3 of 97, and that's where it stopped.
We had the option this year to e-learn or to send the kids to school, and I opted to send them to school. For me, e-learning was not a real option for this school year because I don't want my kids to fall behind. Like next year, my youngest is moving from grade school to middle school, my middle is moving from middle school to high school, and my oldest is becoming a senior. It did not feel as though any of them could afford to lose this school year before moving on to next year. This is such an important transition year.
Why did you stop calling the parents?
Oh, I just ran out of time. Those 3 phone calls took up my entire planning period, and they were good conversations. So being able to connect with people, have them ask the questions or share their feedback or whatever it may be. But I didn't have enough time. To continue that way was not the most efficient way of me using my time. It's the most effective, but I still wouldn't be through my list, even today.
My everyday life really hasn't changed that much, but my wife teaches at a local high school and has to report there every day. And like one of the first days that came back, maybe a couple meetings later, they had a teacher and he lost his sense of taste and he lost his sense of smell. And so he obviously went and got tested because those were the symptoms. And he tested positive, and Lauren, my wife, actually had lunch with him that day.
Because it's rural PA, they organized homecoming. The parents did, and had a homecoming dance for juniors and seniors a couple weeks ago. You're looking at the pictures online and you're like, what are you thinking? And you watch the case count, and we are in a county in which the case count is rising right now, and it's rising pretty rapidly. And so you sit there and you're looking at the kids and they're body surfing. and they're as close as they can all be together, taking pictures, and you're like, I get that you're kids, but maybe at some point we could have skipped this one and hoped for prom in the spring, but had not done homecoming. I look at the kids I found pictures of, and they're on my son's soccer team. And I'm like, are you going to bring something to practice now? So you get a little bit more worried. And I try not to think too like we're going to be in some bubble where this isn't going to affect us individually, because when you do that, you lose empathy for people who are sick. So yeah, it's always in the back of your mind. It's probably not any different than worrying about school shootings in some respects. When you send your kids into school and you're like, okay, are you going to come home today because some kid decided that today's the day that they're going to come in with a gun? So it's a trade-off. It's almost just like trading one fear for another.
In my husband's research, where was it? Was it the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden? Who didn't do anything. They didn't do social distancing. They didn't do the masks. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but they basically had a nationwide chickenpox party. When my parents were young, if somebody got the chickenpox, everybody would send all their kids over for a sleepover, so all their kids would get the chickenpox, because you only get chickenpox once, and then you've got the antibodies, and you can't get it again. You can get shingles, I guess, as an adult, but that's beyond the point. And so basically the entire country of Switzerland, Sweden, did a big chickenpox party. If somebody got it, then they got it, and they went and they were treated for it, and if they worked through it, they have the antibodies and they weren't getting it again. And their mortality rate wasn't higher, and they were, for all intents and purposes, they were fine. Obviously, there are people that are going to get it that have compromised immune systems or other comorbidities that create a danger for them to have it. But for the vast majority of the population, they work through it and they get through it okay. And my personal feeling on that is every disease is that way. Every disease. There is going to be a portion of the population that is going to have a more difficult time recovering from it. Influenza, just the flu. We don't quarantine. We don't social distance. We don't wear masks when it comes to the flu. We don't do it when it comes to even pneumonia. I mean, there are going to be people that get the flu and die. There are going to be people that get pneumonia and die. There are going to be people that get COVID and die. But not everybody. The way that it is portrayed that, oh my goodness, if you get COVID, it's going to ruin the rest of your life. There are people that are going to be that way. There is a teacher at one of my kids' schools, and his lung function is down to 80%, and it is never going to be any better. He can no longer do marathons. He used to run marathons. He cannot do it anymore. He can no longer physically do it because of his lung capacity. So yeah, there are going to be people that it is life-changing for them. But is it worth going through everything we're going through to what we're doing to small businesses in this country? Is it worth it? That's kind of the biggest one for me. I've always been a small business advocate, and it really upsets me to see long-standing businesses having to close their doors because they can no longer afford to work as a business to keep their doors open and maintain their overhead. I just think it was all blown out of proportion. And if we had just been smart and calm and not, oh, what am I trying to say? They made such a big deal about it, and I don't think that was necessary. I think that the world would be a better place if we had been more logical about how we were going to react.
So I went to the ER, and I don't know if anyone here knows about like breathing and what's healthy breathing, but basically your breathing should be about 95-98% oxygen level in your blood. That means you have enough oxygen in your blood. I, though, was at 70%. Basically, I should have been in a coma, and I was on 4 liters of oxygen, so I had an intense amount of oxygen being put into my body. And so they put me into a room, and I think I go about 6 or 7 hours before anyone comes into the room, and I'm actually hyperventilating the whole time. What I didn't know was that I was experiencing hypertension. So my entire body would like tense up like this, where I couldn't breathe for about 30 seconds, then would relax, and I could breathe again. And this went on for about 8 hours of me breathing like this. And the nurses kept coming in, and they were all male nurses. And they came in and they said,
Tiffany, you need to control your breathing. We're going to have to put you on a ventilator because you're breathing. You need to control yourself.
and I was like, this is involuntary. And then I had a male nurse say to me,
Are you sure you're not just having a panic attack?
excuse me, you know I have coronavirus. You know I've been to the hospital 4 times. So for him to just say that to me, finally, I had no sense of time either, because coronavirus kind of makes you hallucinate and makes you not think well, like your cognitive function isn't great. So I can only gauge based off of the shifts of the nurses. So by the 4th nurse in, so 12 hours now, he looked at me and he was like, he walked into the room and I saw him on the phone, and he was on the phone with the pharmacist, and he said,
I think she's having hypertension. Can I give her a Valium?
and so they gave me Valium, and within 2 minutes, my breathing, my hypertension went away and my breathing was better. That's all I needed. All I needed was for someone to say she's having hypertension, and not assuming that I'm having a panic attack because I'm a woman of color. For them to assume that I was just sort of having a mental health breakdown. You know, there was actually a time where I was lying on that table and I thought, if I die, it's because the United States healthcare system failed me. And I have really good insurance. So everything that was happening to me, I was like, wow, I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. Wow, I have an MFA from Columbia University. I am healthy and this is happening. And I understand at the time it was very new. Nobody really knew what was happening with the virus, but I guarantee, I know how I look and I present, right? But I guarantee if I was Kathy Williams, instead of Tiffany Rosalinda de Vega, right? And if I walked in with blue eyes and had bright blonde hair, I would have had different treatment. Guarantee it. I just know it.
So when you get COVID, one of the things that is unique about this virus and has caused a lot of problems is it makes you what we call hypercoagulable. And what that means is your body is more inclined to create blood clots, okay? So when you have blood clots circulating through your body, if they go to, let's say, a blood vessel in your heart or your lung or your kidney, they block blood flow to that area starts to die. So that is what can cause a stroke. That is what can cause a heart attack. That is what can cause kidney failure, or what we like to call well, I'm not going to go into it, but one person came in and they were COVID positive and they threw a massive clot. It must have been huge. They threw it in the ER before we'd even put them on a ventilator, and it went into one of their lungs, the arteries in their lungs. And it was so big, and I don't know how to help. Maybe the guy was already weak. I don't know, but it blew the artery and the guy started actively bleeding into his lung. And it happened so quickly, we couldn't save him. And so this guy, I basically watched this guy drown in his own blood. So that's what I mean by outliers. Those weren't common in the ER, but they happened, and they were very, very frightening. That's a good word.
Seeing death is a part of what I do as an emergency physician, so we're used to saying what I would call a usual amount of death. Every death is difficult to deal with, but I'm used to what I would call a baseline level of that happening, because that's a part of what I do. The coronavirus changed the scale of that. We saw numbers at a scale we weren't accustomed to seeing, and we weren't initially sure what the best thing to do was for these patients. So it was extremely frustrating to see death at that scale. As the pandemic has gone on, we've learned a lot, and we've learned quickly. And that's very good, but those early months were very difficult.
That was the hardest part to navigate, because as a city we were suffering. I don't think people understand the impact in parts of Queens and Brooklyn and Rockaway Beach, all those places that were hit so hard. Especially Elmhurst, Queens was the epicenter, and that's the hospital closest to me. I would always say that with the amount of sirens I would hear going down my street, I was wondering when the next siren I would hear would be for me to go to the hospital.
You mentioned earlier how you really don't like Seattle, so I'd love to hear the story behind that, if you feel comfortable sharing it.
Yeah, we transit through Seattle all the time. That's how you get in and out of Alaska. So we have a bunch of friends that live there. Certainly enjoyed it as tourists before, but when we got there this time,
Did you hear my part?
we're supposed to be staying with a friend who's got an Airbnb unit in the basement, totally private, so that we each have our own space. Won't be bugging them with the new baby or having labor at home or whatever. And the expectation with the husband was that we would get tested when we arrived, they would get tested, we'd quarantine, and we're expecting to be there for 6 or 8 weeks, waiting for the baby to come, and then after until we were healthy to fly afterwards. And then after the quarantine period, our kids who were the same age as their kids would play together. Maybe not inside spaces, but like in the yard, in the neighborhood, especially give the kids something a little more normal once we had taken all those safety precautions. And the husband was on board with that. The wife was not. And it got weird. It got really weird. I mean, I don't know what she was saying to the neighbors. I don't know what the neighbors were saying to her. But it got to the point that like kids in the neighborhood would be playing together and parents would pull their kids away when ours approached. Just really mean. And we were past the quarantine phase. We had a negative test. We had been more like isolated than anybody there. We had been in this Airstream by ourselves for weeks, and yet us coming in as the outsiders, we were pretty frozen out. People had their in-group and wanted nothing to do with anyone else.
And of course, Seattle was one of the first places to get hit hard. So I think they were maybe in the grips of some sort of post-traumatic syndrome. I don't know what they were. They were jerks. That's all I know.
We also got our tires slashed there.
We got our tires slashed. Yeah, they're really passive aggressive, and yeah, Seattle's not the best. Yeah.
This kind of near the outsider and you're frozen out, I really hadn't experienced except for like mean middle school girls. And then it was coming from adults, and one adult in particular who had been a good friend previously. It was very disorienting and strange.
So I'll just say that I think COVID, or maybe grief, just reveals a lot in people. It tears away the veneer that a lot of people hide behind, and some real surprises. Certainly not what I would or you would expect.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of generosity from strangers too. A lot of connecting, a lot of people stripped from all the distractions in life, being fundamentally good people at heart too. It was just a shame that we ended the trip with such a bad experience, because I think for the most part, most of the people we met along the way were just trying to get by, trying to feel out their own situation and trying to connect with others, how the pandemic had changed each other's lives. And I think on balance, it was a lot more goodness and connection than badness. But the last experience, it was hurtful.
We closed our unit on April 2nd. Again, it's usually an adult and acute inpatient care unit, and we closed it to accommodate more COVID patients.
Oh, were you worried about your patients?
Yeah, I still am. On the day our unit closed, I wrote all of my patients, not one to send them, just for me. I feel like creativity helps us heal our own psychological wounds. So I just wrote them a letter expressing my worry for them and my hope that they'd be doing okay. One of the good things that came out of COVID was that for a while, not all psychiatric patients are undomiciled or substance users, but I'd say about 30% of my population is, and they tend to be the frequent flyers, which means I tend to get the most attached to them. So I was quite worried about our homeless substance using population during this time, but one of the nice things was that they had a lot of them staying in hotels, and it turned into a surprising stint of stability for them when they were able to be in a private room without other substance users present. And so for a lot of the ones I have spoken to since the closing of our unit, it turned into a surprising period of stability for them. We've got some guys who've been sober since April, which is really exciting for them. But yes, especially now in times of economic distress and crisis in the world, those are the times when first break psychosis goes up, anxiety goes up, suicide rates increase, depression and substance abuse and alcohol use, and those are my people. And the fact that they're at the most risk right now, and that other people who might have not previously had a psychiatric illness are susceptible to developing one during this time, and that we're not here, and that our unit is dark, and that I don't know who's taking care of them. It gives me a lot of anxiety.
After 6 days, I didn't think I was ready to go home, but they decided my oxygen level was about 85% at that point, and I still had a cough, but they decided to send me home because they told me, and I quote,
"We need your bed because people are dying in the ER. And you're okay. We don't think you're going to die, but People will die in the ER if you don't give up your bed.
So I went home after 6 days.
How did you get through that? You were sick and you were grieving, and I know personally being sick and miserable physically makes me...
Yeah, I had to do everything I could to make myself laugh. It took a long time to also, once I was actually healed, I guess you could say, it took a long time to get my lungs back, and I could only walk about 4 blocks to the supermarket and back without getting winded. Then I have to wait at the bottom of the stairs and walk up 3 flights of stairs with my grocery. That got better. I got to go from 4 blocks to 10 blocks, so I got to go to a different supermarket. Oh, joy.
When I asked them, what do I do now? How do I recover? They said,
we have no idea.
So I had no assistance. My PCP also throughout this whole time never returned my phone calls and never saw me, right? So even when I was sick, I couldn't even get my own doctor to see me. It took me 2 months to recover, 2 months to be able to work out, 2 months, people, to go up the stairs. And even then I had no assistance from any doctor. No doctor would see me. I couldn't get any appointment. So I basically had to do all my research by myself and call my friends who are doctors and pharmacists and self-diagnose myself and self-medicate myself. And I'm actually still doing that right now because no doctor will see me. The only doctor that'll see me is my dermatologist.
But as far as like keeping your spirits up, like I dug out the best comedy movies I could find. My mother was very funny, so the stories that I started writing about her, they brought me out of it. And they pulled me out of that dark place. But also, I just think if you sit in that pit of despair for too long, you just get to the point where like, oh, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you just have to pull yourself up and say, my mother lived a good life. She was a good person. She gave me all of her values. She gave me all of her stories. She gave me all of her jokes and personality. And I was able to take that with me and turn it into some art. Because I'm used to painting with people's bodies in midair. I'm used to decorating the stage with flying people. That was my art. That's what I did. But it's not been available to us for the past 8 months. As an acrobat, there's not much you can do in your living room. So I changed art forms and became, I'm not a writer, I'm not a chef, and I'm not an editor, but right now I am.
What's it been like as a parent, especially a parent who's an actor right now?
Awesome. I'm home in that sense, in that one sense, because I work off hours. I work in the evenings and on weekends. So Beatrix is in school and she comes home from school. We have a couple of hours together and I go to work. So in that sense, the greatest piece of the pandemic for me is that I'm with Beatrix 24 hours a day. And we comment on that a lot because we do really enjoy each other. And I feel fortunate that I have a kid who likes me and wants to be around me. So that part's cool. That part I like.
So what fun things have you done with your daughter?
Oh, I'll tell you, you like this one. So her dad lives in San Diego and we had to get her there and I didn't want to put her on a plane. So back in June, we rented an RV, which I've never been in before and never had any interest in being in before because gross. And we drove that RV to San Diego and then I was in the RV for 92 days. And at the end of it, I went back to San Diego and I picked up Beatrix and her sister and the dogs and the cats and the everybody's. And we drove back across country and we did all kinds of stuff. I mean, I literally was like, where do you want to go? So we saw all kinds of stuff. It was awesome.
We were plotting our course looking at the news every day. What cities we're driving through or not? Where's COVID spiking or not?
It's funny because I would post on social media about it and friends who were constantly, despite COVID, being like, oh, stop by our place and come visit here.
We have a parking spot for you.
Come park the Airstream. Someone would be like, oh, you guys look like you're having a great time, which would drive Rachel nuts because
I'm 30 weeks pregnant in a pandemic in a car every day so that I don't have to take an airplane. Like, we're not on a pleasure vacation, seeing a lot of things, making the best of it, but
it's just constant decision-making, risk assessment, and not knowing where you're going to sleep each night.
Trying to deal with that as a couple and then making it fun for the kids. Like, we didn't want the kids to know this is some dramatic, stressful thing. Oh, fun, summer vacation. We're on a road trip, girls. Because they're 4 and 5. They didn't need to be carrying any of that stress. And I think we succeeded in that. And I think that's what a lot of people saw on Facebook.
For a while, one of the things I was doing was like really hating on my friends' Facebook accounts when they're like quarantine cooking. Like, I just made a cool thing. And somebody else is like, let's have a yoga Zoom tonight. And I'm like, you assholes. Sorry.
They were like, your trip looks so fun. We're like, everything's closed because there's a pandemic. And then other people were really in touch with that. That must have been really intense. It's been interesting seeing who's been kind of salivating to get out of the house and seeing it as a fun vacation I wish we were doing, and who's really had that higher consciousness of, that's a crazy thing to have to do right now. I had never done any RVing.
I hadn't either.
We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into.
As usual.
Only flighted the Airstream once.
But I don't think it caught fire.
It did not catch fire, no. Just the one flood.
Yeah, I ripped off the back bumper, I jackknifed it, crashed the truck right into it.
Ripped off the stairs.
Ripped off the stairs.
The exterior stairs, yeah. There's 2 of them to get into it.
But no fires.
Are there any like horror stories you have, like being on the RV?
I regularly got poop in my shoe because you have to empty it all out, and it does kind of like leak a little bit. So that's my worst part. And it's I see your face, and I see you, and I feel that, but somehow it's a thing that normalizes. You're just like, it's part of it. You just wear shoes that like you hose off. I mean, seriously. And then you get good at it, and then it doesn't happen anymore. Like, isn't that gross? I can't believe that I'm even saying that. It was so out of our normal life of living on 43rd and 10th. It was fabulous.
So what's this flood you keep referring to?
When you're driving, you have to turn all your systems off. So your water pump, and you want your electricity off because the whole thing's shaking while it's bouncing down the road. And our trailer in particular, the handle and the sink bounced around a lot.
We gave our 5-year-old daughter the job of making sure the pump was off. Each kid had like a list of responsibilities that they had to do, like making sure the truck was hitched to the trailer. Okay, go 5-year-old.
Well, we were the bosses. We were checking.
It's her fault.
We're not blaming the 5-year-old, but the handle and the sink bounced loose, and then there's the cover that goes in the sink. Also, so the water is just splashing onto the cover and then onto the floor, and we noticed it somewhere in Kentucky. Why is there a stream of water that I can see from the rear view mirror pouring out of the back of the Airstream? Fortunately, you're limited by how much water is in your tank. We only had half a...
So it was just a 36-gallon flood. It wasn't that bad.
We didn't close the refrigerator door all the way one time, and the food was everywhere. It's like a boat. Everything has to be clicked shut, and if it doesn't like latch shut, it will just fly open.
When you live a life like we live a life where I go to work and my hair is blown out for me, I have somebody who cleans our apartment, I started to feel like my life wasn't mine anymore, that everything I did was dictated by somebody else or done by somebody else. And Beatrix felt that, like we were constantly chasing our life. So instead, we got in an RV where we literally provided everything for ourselves. We only used our own bathroom. We cooked all our own food. We drove ourselves someplace if we wanted to go. We made decisions on when we wanted to go and where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do. And we did it all together. We slept in this thing that we drove. It was awesome. That piece of it, I felt like we just took our own life. And I was like, come here, we're gonna do this all together. It was great. We can cook you anything over fire.
You seem to have this passion for marginalized communities. Where do you think this comes from?
Well, I come from a marginalized community, so let's put it that way. My family was incarcerated in World War II. I grew up with a single mother, so I had that strike against me. We were pretty poor growing up, so I feel like I come by it naturally. Like, I have a lot of identification with them. But I was really lucky. And at the ripe old age of 60, I come to see that it just wasn't luck that allowed me. It was my white passing that afforded me the luxury of being able to not have just be pigeonholed by where I came from. Whereas maybe if I had more melanin in my skin, that might not have been the case.
Where I'm from is not a very diverse area, but I do have several friends in our area who are Black men and women, and I do feel for their and what they and I do feel for them and what they go through in their everyday life. And it's hard to find a way to verbalize because a lot of people look at me and say, "Oh, well, you're just a white male. You don't have any idea what I go through," and I don't. And that makes it hard to relate on that topic because I do feel for my friends and that might not feel as comfortable in certain settings as I do. And I hate to see my friends go through anything that I can't try and help them out with, or I can't. Hard to verbalize sometimes. But I feel like there's probably a level where I can help, but I don't want people to look at me and say, well, he's just running for office or because he's just doing this. And I want them to know that I do feel for their pain and I would love to find a good way that I could help them.
I'm Puerto Rican, but having a Black family, right? Black husband, Black child, and thinking about that, like how do we make some sort of change? Because we weren't going to protest. We suffered so much from, because there's various different ways that you could protest. There's various ways you can be an activist. And for us, we suffered so much from coronavirus that we didn't want to expose ourselves by going to these protests.
Protests are part of our First Amendment, right? That's you're allowed to protest. That's one of the great things about this country, that protected right. But the violence and the negativity that comes out of those protests, they aren't protests. They're unlawful.
Our theater company participated in the Open Your Lobby support for protesters, which was conducted by a coalition of theaters who provided snacks, water, and bathroom access to protesters all across Brooklyn and Manhattan. I organized it for our theater and volunteered for them as well so that we could help out. So we can help out protesters so that they could do what they were doing on the days that I wasn't protesting.
And I hate to see those things happen, but I also hate to see the injustices that cause people to move that they feel like they have to move to these places where they have to protest or even sometimes end up in violent states. Or it doesn't have anything to do with politics. It doesn't have anything to do with our president. I think it has to do with our hearts. I don't want to see people put in positions where they feel like they have to protest. And I would just love to see us all get along. And I know that's like a perfect society that we'll probably never be able to achieve or probably even see. But I just wish we could love each other for who we are and not have these instances that push people to where they feel like they have to protest or even end up in these violent states.
But seeing the protests, how it feels different, I feel like white people all of a sudden have woken up and realized, oh my God, we were in the Matrix this whole time. I didn't realize racism still existed. But like otherwise, that it doesn't feel so much different because this has been happening since this has been happening since the entire history of our country.
Were you raised in a politically minded household? Like, what was your family's relationship to politics?
I wouldn't say necessarily politically minded. We were a household that was full of discussions about all types of issues, but it wasn't along any type of party line. It was just to talk about issues at hand. At time, there was a really hot debate, which was fun.
My relation to politics is a little fuzzy. I actually got to meet Hillary Clinton in 2016 when she was running for president. And I got a little bit of news from that. It was an encounter that a lot of people had thought of differently when it comes to campaigning. Those kinds of meetings, those kinds of settings and things that led to 2 years later, I'm running for Senate here in West Virginia. And I'm a Christian conservative, so my ideas are a little bit different than that of someone like Secretary Clinton, but
I grew up with this sort of crazy dad who was like, if life is hard and something terrible happens, make something good out of it. He was very like that. Like, you only live once. Don't sit around and wait. So I don't believe in sitting around and waiting. I was like, let's go have an experience. And boy, did we meet a lot of crazy different people.
Really? So what kind of people?
You guys are all political, right? I'm assuming Berkeley Carroll, Brooklyn. I mean, I met a lot of people who are voting for Trump. It was really something else. It was something. It was really good for my kids. You know, we live in such a bubble of everybody we know is voting for the same people. And so in that experience, it was really, really, really wild to get out into more of a rural America and meet all different families, all different people, and try to understand their perspective, understanding that they weren't ever going to change the way that I feel, the way that I vote, but, you know, certainly being two married women with kids in an RV park in the middle of Montana is an incredibly different experience than being two married women and walking through the village.
Did they make you like angry? Like, did you feel?
They made my wife really angry. They didn't make me angry. It made me sad more. The divisiveness. I don't believe in that. My parents were Republicans and they weren't mean Republicans. And I don't think that all Republicans are mean, but I think that Trump, this is just me, my political belief is that he's divisive. He's intentionally divisive in order to make his supporters feel seen and heard. And so I wanted to see them and hear them without being contentious. It was my goal.
I would say it's not only the coronavirus that has become political, but science and trust and scientists and doctors and authority figures of various kinds. There's an element in our country that doesn't trust science. People who deny that vaccines work or indeed that the coronavirus exists at all. And that's very disappointing. It doesn't always break down neatly by political party. There are certainly folks in the Democratic Party who are anti-vax or want to be able to pick and choose which science they like to believe in and which science they think is no good. I think in broad strokes, science denial is a little bit more of an issue on the Republican Party side of things. But I think the left has some of our own introspection that we can do regarding these issues.
So, who do you plan on voting for in this coming election?
I don't generally discuss my specific vote. I can tell you that I generally lean left and Democratic.
That is interesting. I want to say that feelings here are very covert, and that is the nature of the South as well. So you can have these deep, very deep and strong feelings and allegiances and not communicate them out loud. And that's just the standard. Our neighborhood doesn't have any Biden signs, but it also doesn't have any Trump signs. And I don't think people are indifferent. I think everybody has, for the most part, has made the decision, but there's no need to be overt.
How about you, if you feel comfortable sharing, which way are you leaning?
Oh my God. That's like asking me my age. But what I will say is, and you may not all know, I was about to say you may not be old enough, but the 43rd president, who was George Bush, we were all up in arms about George Bush, and the current president, which one of my friends likes to call 46 minus 1, that's what they call him, is no comparison. Like, I'm just amazed that nobody's mentioned Bush at all. But when Bush was in office, there were so many things that were wrong about him and his administration. But yeah, that's an interesting comparison.
I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Hamilton County, which is a swing county in a swing state. And I'm very proud of that. In my first election, I voted for the first George Bush. So I voted Republican. And my parents were Republican. I grew up in a very Republican area, and it just made sense to me. And then as I got older and I moved to New York and I became an actor, my dad and I used to have really big arguments, not because I was walking in the door and saying, this is my belief system and this is your belief system, and I don't agree with your belief system, but because my dad would say, you're a liberal Democrat who lives in a bubble in New York City, and would start yelling at me all the things that he'd heard on the news because of where I lived. And I would say, you are typing me based on my zip code, not based on who I am and not based on what I'm saying. I have two aunts right now I know are going to vote for Trump, and they're two of my staunchest supporters, and they've both been calling me, and I've been having a really hard time calling them back. I don't know what to say to them because their vote discredits so much of my life.
And that must make you sad too, right?
Totally sad and conflicted. I think about them. They're both in their late upper 80s. How do I call them and say what I just said to you? I mean, I could, but I just think, is it worth it?
Do you even think that they'll change?
No, I don't think that they would change their vote. I think they're voting the way a lot of Trump voters vote, based on their wallet and based on their money that they've saved their whole lives, that they want to leave to their kids, to their trust fund. Many Republicans are voting because of the economy, and they believe what they believe, and that's America. That's my feeling on it. It's their American right to get to vote for who they want. And I don't like it, but they might not like that I'm married to a woman if we're being real. So
You feel like do you feel like you're kind of the odd one out when it comes to the beliefs in your state or the South even in general?
I would say yes. And I would say, and that's overall, not just about who has the right to do what or what is of the greatest value. Just going against the status quo here is a very hard thing to do. And I think my time in New York has prepared me for that, because once you have the understanding, there's no way you can turn back. So like, for instance, right now, my hair is what you would consider natural. So it doesn't have any chemicals in it. It's not been straightened, but there are still people here who relax, or quote unquote, relax their hair. And I think that's always a shock or surprise to see that that's still the standard. It's kind of like having a Jheri curl in 2021. It's like an 80s type of thing.
Lord, kids are tough today. My hope is we get the current leader of the United States out and get some decency back into the United States and get some decency back into the leadership. That is my hope, and it is a prayer, and it is a necessity. We will not survive as a society with this path that we're on right now if we don't excommunicate that from our leadership.
How do you feel about our country how do you feel about how our country has dealt with this pandemic?
That's a big question. And some of our trip was maybe even questioning the phrase "our country." We went from New Hampshire to Louisiana to Texas to Idaho. We drove through Amish country, and we're just kind of shaking our heads like, why? Why are all of these people governed by the same government? We met Cajuns whose families had been in the bayou in Louisiana for 400 years. We were at a store with Amish folks in their bonnets and masks.
The stunner is everybody continues to call themselves a country. That's the stunner, and buy into this whole story of the Constitution and the Founding Father. It is a powerful story, and it's only reinforced when you see how different these different cultures are.
Different places are doing different things because they're different sorts of people with different histories and different values, different ways of life. And any other continent-sized country like this is not a single country. It's got a whole bunch of countries in it. It's South America is not a single country. It's got a whole bunch of countries in it. And our impression was, in terms of values, in terms of how people respond to crisis, risk tolerance level, we're made up of 50 different little countries at least. And the American myth, the American dream that holds it all together, is a really powerful one because it so far has.
Well, we'll see in the next couple of weeks, but I'm an optimist. But I don't think that, as W.B. Yeats, the poet, once said, the center cannot hold. I don't think the country is going to stay together, to be honest. And what form that's going to take, I don't know. But whether it's the coast that split off or
the states getting more power themselves.
California does its own thing, I don't know. But at a certain point, it just cannot hold. People are too different. And I think the only out in the whole situation is aliens invade and we're all united as a world to fight some common enemy. But it's just, people are too different. People are too far apart and the stories are too different and things run its course. And my feeling on it is there are a lot of good people with different backgrounds and different desires for life and different ways to teach their kids about life. And what is it? 250 years was a pretty good run.
Not that we're advocating for sedition. That's a felony.
No, my wife was the judge on the island, so whenever I do stupid things, she tells me.
So what's at stake for you, like, in this election?
I think peace of mind. As this Trump presidency has unfolded the way that it has, I definitely have felt less secure. Definitely in travel, I felt less secure. I take certain precautions when driving that I didn't take before, and certain considerations about where I stop and where my purse is and what happens if I'm pulled over and stuff like that. And I fear that there will be a greater kind of divide that continues to widen in this country, as well as greater animosity against people who have different views, and we're not able to communicate those views in a way that shows respect and decency, but one that escalates with some type of violence or threat or snarkiness and all those things. And also our health. COVID is still raging and our president is ignoring it or has given up.
What would you say to someone who doesn't take the virus seriously, who says it's a hoax, who says it's going to go away?
Tell that to the 10 friends that I had to bury. Tell that to my mother whose ashes are in my cupboard because I couldn't bury her. Tell that to the 200,000 people and the 200,000 families affected by a hoax. That's what I would say. It's not real to those people until it affects them directly, but it is. It is very real and it doesn't discriminate.
I was a soccer coach prior to all this going on, and I just love to do things with kids and see the way kids interact with one another. The hateful things that we see in this country, like racism and the way people treat each other as adults, is not something that we're born with. I think it's something that is either taught or learned. If you watch children interact with one another, they don't see color, they don't see race, they don't see religion or anything else like that. They just see other kids and want to have fun. And I feel like if we can learn so much if we just paid a little bit more attention to our kids, and then maybe we'd see a little bit more of what they're doing in ourselves. And we paid so much attention to them instead of asking them to pay so much attention to us. And yeah, I feel like that can really change us.
So now you want to get real. All right. You're like, just tack on a little question. Why don't you talk about how you've blown up your life?
Maybe I should have asked this earlier.
That's really cute. No. I think it's actually a very good question, and I'm actually very happy to answer it. I think the reality is myself and many of my colleagues developed some pretty bad PTSD as a result of this. Just because it was just like walking to work every day. I walked to work. I walked past the freezer trucks full of bodies. I had to walk past them to get to work. So there's that. I go in, I'm terrified to be in there with a mask on. I'm seeing all these patients dying or being ventilated. I come home and the first thing my husband asks is, what's going on? How's the whole COVID thing? And I talk with my friends on Zoom. What's going on? What's going on with COVID? And it became something that I could not escape. And so it really did. It kind of usurped my life for a solid 2 months. And as a result of that and a myriad of other things, I developed really some pretty intense PTSD to the point where I was anxious all the time. I began drinking heavily. I took drinking to a dark place. I was drinking to like shut up my brain.
Like a coping mechanism?
A maladaptive coping mechanism. Okay, yeah. There were times when my husband would find me on the couch, glassy-eyed, having been up drinking all night by myself, intermittently crying over maybe something I was watching or just for no reason at all. I started reliving a lot of past traumas. I didn't realize that was something that happens when you have PTSD. A lot of past trauma that you thought you had dealt with starts coming to the fore, and it got very, very dark for a period. I thought about hurting myself a lot towards the end, and I am genuinely lucky that I did not do that and that I did not try to take my life.
Right now, I feel like I've been experiencing some post-traumatic growth. So April and May, myself and my very small team were solely supporting staff at the hospital, and I functioned, but I lost my mind. It was one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had. And when I say I lost my mind, I mean I had some panic attacks about coming into work. Trauma induces other trauma. So if we've had previous traumas, experiencing another trauma will bring that up, and we tend to regress to the periods during which we were experiencing trauma previously. So at the time, I was trying to help the staff process all of their trauma. It brought me back to a time when I was much younger, and so I regressed a little bit to that age. And at the time, I had very little self-esteem, and I genuinely thought that I didn't know what I was doing any of the time. And that's something I have overcome in general, but it was very difficult for me to believe that I was helpful in any way, shape, or form, or that I was providing any needed support in the hospital.
What ended up helping was a colleague of mine who I was just kind of shooting the shit with, and I mentioned that I was having all these problems, and she said, oh, my cousin is a social worker, and there's this network of like social workers, psychologists that are kind of forming this network to give like 10 free sessions for healthcare workers that are experiencing forms of PTSD. And so I started talking to this therapist, and it just changed everything. I was able to she really helped me not only process what I experienced in COVID, but also everything else that had kind of come up that I had tried to ignore for 2 decades, but COVID kind of put a microscope, like put a magnifying glass on it and made it like I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I'm much better now. There's the cat. Hi, lady.
I put on about 15 pounds, which I have yet to take off, and I will forgive myself for it, but it's also upsetting. So yeah, I was not at my best mental health at that. I can say with great certainty.
Has this period in your life taught you anything?
I used to be far more anxious about things at my personal baseline. Now my perspective has shifted significantly. So if I'm thinking like, hey, is this anxiety inducing? It's like, well, is this a temporary morgue outside of a hospital filled with dearly loved people who didn't get to say goodbye to their families? No, then it's not stressful. Take a deep breath. And remember that the plumbing is amazing. And that the things that we take for granted in life, like having heat and air conditioning and lights and a refrigerator that works where you can preserve your food and you don't have to go hunt it, like just really looking at the small things that are so tremendously amazing that I previously neglected to appreciate. I hope for. I have so many delicious hopes. I guess in terms of, here, I'll do it really. My team has been making paper cranes. And so these are our cranes of grief and gratitude. And so inside are things that the staff at large are grateful for or grieving. And we've got almost 2,000 now. Because, every you make 1,000, you get a wish. So I'm hoping that we get to 5,000 cranes. And obviously that the magic comes true.
I hope that we make the right decision in a few weeks. And it may not be for everyone, the ideal candidate or place to start or what they ultimately want, but it is a place to start to where we can achieve better unity and justice for all so that everyone can prosper. I hope that we do come together. I see this as an opportunity. We're at a point we can move towards progress. I would say don't stop fighting. Fight your righteous fights and keep at it, because it's the solution's not going to happen overnight. We just have to continually be feeling that this is our world. This is our community. This is our government. It's not theirs. It's ours. So don't lose hope. In the end, I really believe we will transcend all of this in a positive way.
A less bitter and divisive political environment would, I think, be quite helpful. A different president. I know I said I wasn't going to say who I was voting for, but that's probably a little spoiler right there. Let's see, a vaccine that gets distributed quickly and efficiently. Actually, as long as I'm hoping, I'll say more than one vaccine, because of the scale that we need. We're talking literally hundreds of millions of doses. We probably need more than one, a safe and effective vaccine, so that people all around the world can get it in sufficient quantities, so that we can beat the coronavirus and go back to some kind of new normal.
I hope that we can move past this and that our small businesses can recover, and the people that have been working their life dreams and put their life savings into those businesses can rebound. And if not, rebuild. At least find a way to recover, whether that is financially or emotionally or in some cases physically. There are people that this has ruined our lives, their livelihood. My hope is that the people that are running those businesses can recover.
I hope that we will, as a country, we somehow collectively pull our heads out of the sand and realize that, I hate sounding like it, but we're all in it together. I'm sorry, you can't wait for something to impact you for it to matter. And I think that that's been something that we've seen, as it's a constant theme throughout this country and this pandemic, is that, oh, it doesn't impact me, and so it doesn't matter. I hope that we get through that, and I hope that that becomes something that we realize, that when the weakest among us are hurt, or sick, or struggling, that we all are. And that's something you try to teach to your kids, and you try to bring to them. If I give you one thing in the world, it's please understand that empathy with somebody who's not you is the most important thing you can have.
I think my hope is that we will land on our feet, and we being people of color, we being the disenfranchised of all sorts.
Is there anything you'd like to say to someone who doesn't wear a mask?
Wear your damn mask! And that's the short version. I guess the longer and less rude version would be, I've seen horrible things. If you wear a mask, you'll keep us all safe, including you.
My fear and my hope is we'll come through the fire and reemerge stronger and more tested, and maybe with a firmer compass for ourselves, like a firmer North Star, and that'll do good things to people. I guess one of the reasons I'm so dystopic about the country is I think it's built on rotten foundation, and that comes down to race. And it's been incredible to me to see how some of these questions have come to the forefront, even amidst COVID. You know, some of those questions that have been lingering is too weak of a word, but just out there in such terrible ways. Maybe people are kind of forced to look those in the eye and start answering them. So that's another hope.
Return to civility in that we all are more tolerant of each other in every capacity, and for that to begin on November 3rd.
I think my hope is that there's some serious systematic changes that happen across the board for everyone. And I mean everyone. And my hope is that this is the spark of some changes, of some serious changes.
My hope is that regardless of who you're pulling for or who you want to win or whatever else, is that the people in this country can find a way to unite with one another again. We can live with our differences. You've got a good looking head of hair there. I don't have any hair. I'm bald. And I can get past that and not be jealous that you have hair.
What is my hope? My hope is for the breakdown of the association or holding on to like labels and the idea behind the label or something where like, I am that, or I identify you as that. And behind only that, I can identify what this thing is. And I hope that we can expand beyond that and see how multifaceted everything is. And there's no necessarily right or wrong behind a title or name or any kind of label that we put on something, because it doesn't describe what that thing is. It's barely scratched the surface.
Jesus Christ, you can't just end on something like that. All right. What do I hope? I look at what happened in June with Black Lives Matter as an exemplar of what I hope really, I hope this does. I feel like there were a lot of news outlets that were almost shocked by how quickly so many people were mobilized to protest, but in my head, I thought, well, I mean, of course, you've got all these people that had been isolated for 3 months. They're afraid, they're anxious, they've got all this pent-up energy that is now being converted to rage because they realize just how poorly managed this is being, and then people are able to take all of that energy and channel it into something productive with BLM.
With so many Black and brown bodies being murdered, I really had to go to a different place and figure out what was happening. How can I begin to understand? And I figured, you know what? I don't have that much to lose. I need to stand up and figure out how to be a better ally.
And my hope is that this period of time is transformative for everyone, that we really use this time to take a look at ourselves, decide who we are, who we want to be, how we're going to get there, and really commit ourselves to making those changes, not just for ourselves, but for everything around us. We're seeing all the kind of muck and mire of the world right now, and it's very daunting and intimidating, and it makes everyone afraid and anxious, but like, we do have a certain degree of power, and I hope that's what we get from this, that this becomes a watershed moment in the social progression of our country. That was a whole lot.
My greatest hope is that we can learn to listen to one another. Because I can just speak for myself that when I really open my ears and listen to someone, when I listen to their lived experience, I have learned so much. And that has happened to me in this year, during this moment, during this pandemic.